Imagine standing on the walls of a fortress, staring out at the horizon, and seeing not the sea but an ocean of men. 40,000 Ottoman soldiers, banners snapping in the wind, drums pounding like thunder, cannon barrels glinting in the sun. And you, one of only 500 knights sworn to defend this island, know that once those drums begin, your world will be fire and steel. For 4 long months, the impossible happened. Outnumbered 100-1, the knights of St. John stood against the might of Suleiman the Magnificent. This is the story of how 500 warriors faced 40,000 Ottomans, and for a season, turned back the tide of empire. To understand this struggle, we must first step into the world of the early 16th century. The Mediterranean was not a sea of peace, it was a battleground, a chessboard where empires played with lives. Venice and Genoa traded, Spain and Portugal explored, but above all, the Ottoman Empire loomed. When Suleiman came to the throne in 1520, he was young, just 26, but his inheritance was vast. From the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary, from the Black Sea to the Nile, the crescent of Islam stretched farther than any rival could dream. His armies were disciplined, his fleets unrivaled, and his ambition boundless. Yet amidst all this power, a single island infuriated him, Rhodes. It was small, barely a speck compared to the lands he ruled. But on this rock in the eastern Mediterranean stood the Knights Hospitaller, heirs of the Crusades, men sworn to defend Christendom. For over 2 centuries, they had made Rhodes their home, and from its harbors, they launched their swift war galleys. Ottoman ships laden with spices, silks, and slaves rarely passed unscathed. Cargo was seized, prisoners taken, crews slain or sold. Rhodes was not merely an annoyance. It was a dagger in the heart of Ottoman prestige. To control the Mediterranean, Suleiman had to remove it. In the summer of 1522, the young sultan gathered his might. Chroniclers speak of 40,000 men, though others whisper of 60 or even 100,000 when auxiliaries, sailors, and camp followers are counted. Janissaries, his elite shock troops, marched at the core of the army. Cannon, massive bronze monsters, were dragged across land and sea to batter the walls of Rhodes. Cavalry, sappers, and engineers accompanied them, each sworn to break the defiance of the knights. Hundreds of ships shadowed them across the waves, blackening the horizon with sails. When Suleiman's fleet appeared before Rhodes, the islanders knew they stood before a force unmatched in the known world. Inside the walls, the numbers told a grimmer story. 500 knights, supported by perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 mercenaries, townsfolk, and soldiers. Their leader was Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, an aging warrior, but one hardened by decades of service. Under him, every wall, every bastion, every tower of the city was strengthened. Trenches were dug, powder stockpiled, rations counted. The people of Rhodes were called not just to live, but to fight. For the knights, this was not merely a fortress. It was the last outpost of their order, their very reason for existing. To abandon it would mean the end of their brotherhood. The siege began with fire. Ottoman cannon roared, shaking the earth. Stones the size of men smashed into the bastions, shattering towers, sending clouds of dust into the sky. Day after day, the bombardment did not stop. The ground trembled, walls cracked, and yet the knights did not yield. At night, under torchlight, men and women labored to rebuild what had fallen. Rubble became barricades, broken stone was fitted into gaps, earth was piled high. For every hole torn open by Ottoman guns, the defenders closed it again, as though the city itself refused to die. But Suleiman was not a man to waste time. He ordered his janissaries forward. To the beating of drums and the blaring of horns, thousands stormed the breaches, their scimitars flashing in the sun. They climbed ladders, hurled grappling hooks, and swarmed into the gaps left by cannon fire. And there, waiting for them, were the knights. Heavily armored, wielding swords, axes, and maces, they met the janissaries in brutal combat. The breaches turned into killing grounds, where the attackers were cut down in droves. Men slipped in mud and blood, trampled by their comrades as the narrow gaps funneled them straight into the waiting steel of the defenders. The air was filled with fire. From the walls, the knights hurled flaming oil, cast crude grenades packed with gunpowder, and loosed crossbow bolts and arquebus shots into the masses below. The screams of the wounded mingled with the relentless pounding of cannon. Even as their dead mounted in heaps, the Ottomans surged forward, driven by discipline and the command of their sultan. Yet time and again, they were thrown back. The weeks bled into months. Hunger gnawed at both armies. The defenders rationed bread and water. Disease crept into the cramped streets of Rhodes. The Ottomans, too, paid in blood and sickness, their dead littering the fields outside the walls, their graves filling the earth. But Suleiman's fury only grew. If cannon and sword could not break the knights, he would use the earth itself. His engineers began tunneling beneath the walls, digging mines to plant gunpowder and collapse the bastions from below. But the knights countered with their own tunnels, meeting the invaders underground. In the suffocating dark, men fought hand to hand, hacking and stabbing by the light of torches, their screams muffled beneath the soil. At one point, a colossal mine succeeded, tearing apart an entire section of wall in a deafening blast. Dust and stone rained down as Ottoman troops surged into the breach. For a moment, it seemed the city would fall. But in that desperate hour, Grand Master Lyle Adam himself led the counterattack. Clad in armor, wielding his sword, he fought at the front, rallying his men. Side by side with his knights, he drove the Ottomans back, reclaiming the ruins of the wall at staggering cost. The ground ran red, but the banner of the knights still flew. The siege of Rhodes had become more than a battle. It was a trial of wills. 500 knights and their allies stood against 40,000, refusing to yield, refusing to die quietly. Every day they survived was a humiliation to Suleiman. Every assault repelled was a defiance of his empire. And yet, for 4 long months, the impossible continued. By autumn, Rhodes had become a nightmare. The once proud city of whitewashed walls and shining churches was now scarred and broken, its streets filled with rubble, its towers blackened by fire. Inside, the defenders were gaunt, exhausted, and wounded, but still they fought. Outside, the Ottomans pressed ever harder, determined to grind the knights of St. John into dust. The cannon never ceased. Day and night, their thunder echoed across the sea. Ottoman gunners had orders to maintain a constant barrage, to pound the walls until stone turned to sand. The ground itself shook under the impacts, clouds of dust hung in the air, and the once mighty bastions crumbled inch by inch. Yet still the knights repaired what they could, using the very rubble that fell as new fortifications. For every wall shattered, another rose. It was as if the defenders had become part of the stone itself, refusing to yield even as the city around them disintegrated. But sheer numbers began to tell. The Ottomans had 40,000 men. For every janissary who fell, another was ready to take his place. For every engineer cut down, another stepped forward with pickaxe and powder. The defenders had no such luxury. 500 knights, a few thousand mercenaries, and townsfolk who had never been soldiers. This was all that stood between Rhodes and annihilation. Each day thinned their ranks further. Suleiman's fury boiled. He had expected victory within weeks, a quick triumph to crown his reputation. Instead, months dragged on, and still the city defied him. He demanded greater cruelty, greater pressure. Ottoman engineers tunneled endlessly, setting mines to blow apart bastions. One explosion shattered an entire tower, hurling bodies into the air like broken dolls. Hundreds of Turks surged forward, swarming into the breach. The defenders fought like men possessed. Knights locked in hand-to-hand combat with janissaries, swords clashing, axes biting deep. Some defenders, refusing to give ground, grappled their enemies in bear hugs, dragging them down into the rubble so both would die together. When at last the attackers were beaten back, the ground was carpeted with corpses. The brutality escalated. Suleiman ordered prisoners mutilated before the walls, their screams carried into the city to break morale. Knights were flayed alive, their skin nailed to posts, their bodies left to rot in the sun. In answer, the defenders launched their own horrors. Captured Turks were executed and their heads hurled from catapults into the Ottoman lines. Sometimes whole bodies were fired from cannon, crashing grotesquely into enemy trenches. It was psychological warfare at its rawest. Neither side fought merely for victory anymore. They fought to terrify. But there was one problem even the Ottomans could not solve: disease. The summer heat turned Rhodes into a cauldron of death. The stench of thousands of rotting corpses filled the air. Flies swarmed over the battlefield, carrying sickness into both camps. Dysentery and fever ravaged the Ottoman lines, killing as many as the swords of the defenders. Even the Janissaries, fanatical and disciplined, began to falter. Men whispered of curses, of divine punishment. They had come expecting glory and plunder, but found only filth, disease, and endless slaughter. Inside the city, conditions were no better. The defenders drank brackish water, ate meager rations of bread and salted meat, and slept little. Wounds festered for lack of medicine. Yet morale held, bound by iron faith. The Knights of St. John believed that to die in defense of Rhodes was to secure eternal salvation. Their Grand Master, Lal Adam, walked the ramparts daily, inspiring courage by his presence. Even the townsfolk took heart, for the knights stood beside them in the fight. Women carried water to the walls, children fetched stones for fortifications, priests blessed the dying and encouraged the living to fight on. Still, the strain showed. Some mercenaries deserted, slipping over the walls at night, only to be captured and executed by the Ottomans. Yet others fought with grim determination, knowing that surrender meant slavery or worse. The city had become a furnace in which all were consumed. By November, Suleiman was desperate. The campaign had cost him thousands of men and unimaginable wealth. He could not allow this single island to defy him. He ordered a final series of massive assaults, throwing wave after wave of Janissaries into the breaches. The fighting was beyond belief. Knights and townsfolk fought knee-deep in blood, their swords slick, their armor dented and broken. Men hurled rocks, boiling oil, and quicklime down upon the attackers. Primitive grenades burst among the Janissaries, shredding them with shards of iron. Yet still they came, climbing ladders, forcing their way into gaps, screaming the name of Allah as they met the steel of the defenders. At one breach, the knights created what they called the Post of Death. Volunteers chained themselves to the walls so that even if overwhelmed, they could not retreat. They fought until they were literally hacked apart, their broken bodies forming barriers of flesh and steel that slowed the attackers long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The Ottomans began to call them demons, men who could not die. But numbers do not lie. For every Turkish body that fell, 10 more pressed forward. Slowly, inch by inch, the Ottomans pushed closer to the heart of Rhodes. The bastions were shattered, the walls riddled with gaps, the streets choked with corpses. The defenders were at the end of their strength. Suleiman sensed victory. He sent envoys to demand surrender, offering terms of mercy if the city yielded. Lal Adam gathered his knights and the townsfolk to debate. Many urged resistance, preferring death to dishonor. Others, worn by hunger and despair, begged for peace. The Grand Master listened in silence, then raised his hand. We were sworn to defend this island until the last stone fell, until the last drop of blood was spilled. But I will not condemn the people to annihilation. His decision was made. After 6 months of unrelenting siege, the Knights of St. John surrendered Rhodes. The defenders marched out with their banners flying and their weapons in hand, granted safe passage by a grudgingly respectful sultan. Suleiman entered the ruined city, gazing at the wreckage his might had wrought. He had won, but at staggering cost. Tens of thousands of his men lay dead. His treasure drained. His reputation bruised. For the knights, it was exile. They departed Rhodes with heavy hearts, their order homeless once again. Yet their story was not finished. Within a generation, they would be granted a new home, an island called Malta. And when the Ottomans came for them again, decades later, they would discover that the savagery of Rhodes was only the beginning. The smoke of Rhodes lingered for months. Where once stood a radiant jewel of Christendom, only ruin remained. Suleiman had won, but it was not the victory he envisioned. His army had bled rivers of men and treasure, and though he could claim triumph, it felt hollow. The island was his, but the legend of resistance, the legend of a few hundred knights holding out against the greatest empire on earth, was already spreading across Europe like wildfire. For the Knights of St. John, the loss of Rhodes was a catastrophe. They had defended the island for 2 centuries, turning it into a bastion of faith and war. Now, they were wanderers once more, a brotherhood of scarred survivors cast adrift on the seas. Homeless, bloodied, and humbled, many thought their time had ended. Without a fortress, without a base, what use was an order of warrior monks? But they were not finished. Driven from Rhodes, the knights carried with them something more powerful than stone walls. They carried reputation. Across Christendom, whispers grew of their defiance, of their unbreakable courage. 500 knights, holding off 40,000 for 6 months, it was a story too grand to fade. Kings, princes, and common men alike spoke their name with reverence. They were no longer just soldiers, they were symbols, icons of resistance against the tide of the Crescent. For years, they wandered. Some settled temporarily in Italy, others in Crete, still others drifted to the courts of kings, begging for patronage, offering their swords in service. But the order endured. They clung to their vows, to their discipline, to the memory of Rhodes. The loss hardened them, forged their brotherhood into steel. They had tasted destruction and lived, and now they carried a hunger for redemption. Europe itself was uneasy. Suleiman was still young, still ambitious, still hungry for conquest. Rhodes had cost him dearly, but it had also secured him a foothold in the eastern Mediterranean. From there, his fleets roamed unchecked, raiding islands, burning villages, enslaving populations. The sea was becoming an Ottoman lake, and Christendom trembled. The fall of Rhodes was more than a single defeat, it was a warning of what was to come. And then came an answer. In 1530, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, sought to strengthen the defenses of the Mediterranean. He looked to the homeless knights, whose reputation had grown even greater in exile. To them he granted a new home, an island fortress that would become synonymous with their legend. The island of Malta. Malta was a barren rock in the sea, windswept and dry. It lacked the richness of Rhodes, its fields, its harbors, its grandeur. But strategically, it was perfect. It lay at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, a dagger pointed at the heart of Ottoman sea routes. From Malta, the knights could strike at Turkish ships, harass their fleets, and defend the vulnerable coasts of Italy and Spain. To the knights, Malta was no exile, it was destiny. They accepted, and they came to Malta with grim determination. The island became their forge. They rebuilt their order, trained relentlessly, fortified the harbors, and carved fortresses from the very rock. The scars of Rhodes guided them. They knew what it meant to face overwhelming numbers, to endure a siege that seemed impossible. On Malta, they prepared for the day when the Ottomans would come again. And come they would. Suleiman had not forgotten Rhodes, nor had he forgiven the knights. In his mind, they were a thorn, a defiance that would not die. Even as the years passed, even as he conquered new lands, the shadow of those warrior monks lingered. The Sultan's fleets fought them again and again in skirmishes across the Mediterranean, but always the knights endured, their ships striking with precision, their reputation swelling with each victory. For Europe, they became a beacon. Where kings squabbled, where armies faltered, the knights stood firm. They represented an idea larger than themselves, that the tide of conquest could be resisted, that faith and steel could hold against the greatest empire of the age. They were fewer now, perhaps weaker in numbers, but their spirit burned brighter than ever. Malta transformed them. From wanderers they became a legend reborn. Each knight swore his life to defend the island. They dug tunnels, built bastions, and turned the barren rock into a fortress city. Valletta rose from the cliffs, named for Jean de Valette, a grand master whose name would one day echo through history. Decades passed, but the memory of Rhodes never dimmed. It became their story, their banner, their vow. The world believed them finished when the island fell. Instead, they rose stronger, tempered by fire. And when the storm returned, when Suleiman sent his legions once more, Malta would become the crucible where East and West clashed in an inferno that shook the world. The Great Siege of 1565 would come, but until that day, the knights waited, sharpened their blades, and prepared. The lesson of Rhodes had taught them that walls alone do not hold an enemy back. It is the will of men, the iron resolve, the refusal to bow even when the odds are impossible. On Malta, that spirit was eternal. The Ottomans thought Rhodes had ended the story of the Knights of St. John. They were wrong. Rhodes was only the beginning. The years after Rhodes were not quiet. The Mediterranean had become a chessboard, every island and harbor contested between crescent and cross. Suleiman's empire surged outward, Hungary, Mesopotamia, the Balkans, while his fleet prowled the seas, commanded by men like Barbarossa, the dreaded corsair whose name alone sent shivers through Europe. The Ottomans were unstoppable, their banners carried across 3 continents. But in the middle of that sea, a rock bristled with defiance. Malta. From their new home, the Knights of St. John became wolves among the waves. Their galleys, small but swift, struck Ottoman shipping without warning. They seized treasure, freed captives, and burned coastal villages. Each raid enraged Suleiman further. He had cast them from Rhodes, and yet here they were again, sharper than ever, taunting him from the heart of his own domain. The Sultan aged, but his pride never dimmed. He was the lawgiver, the shadow of God on earth, the ruler of the greatest empire in centuries. And still the knights haunted him. Each time they struck his fleets, he was reminded of Rhodes, of the humiliating cost of that long, bitter siege. He had bled tens of thousands of men to break them, and yet he had not destroyed them. In Malta, he saw unfinished business. By the 1560s, Malta had transformed. The barren rock had been carved into a fortress of staggering strength. Bastions rose like jagged teeth above the harbors, gunpowder magazines lined the walls, and every approach bristled with cannon. The knights had turned their exile into an anvil, ready to withstand whatever hammer might fall. They knew Suleiman would come for them again. The only question was when. And in 1565, the storm broke. An armada of nearly 200 ships appeared on the horizon, carrying perhaps 40,000 Ottomans, Janissaries, Sipahis, artillerymen, and corsairs, commanded by Mustafa Pasha and the fearsome Dragut, one of the greatest naval commanders of the age. They descended upon Malta with fire and fury, certain they would crush the tiny garrison in weeks. Inside the fortress, barely 700 knights stood ready, backed by a few thousand soldiers and Maltese townsfolk. It was Rhodes all over again, a handful of warriors facing the might of an empire. And just as before, they refused to yield. The Ottomans pounded the walls relentlessly. Cannon thundered day and night, hurling stone shot that shattered bastions and shook the island to its core. The ground was gouged with trenches, tunnels snaked toward the walls, and mines exploded beneath the defenders' feet. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and prayers. At Fort St. Elmo, a tiny outwork guarding the harbor, the defenders endured weeks of unimaginable horror. The Ottomans swarmed it again and again, pouring thousands of men into the attack. Cannon fire reduced the fort to rubble, but still the knights held on. For over a month, St. Elmo resisted, a bleeding sore that cost the Ottomans thousands of lives. When it finally fell, its defenders fought to the last man, buying time for the rest of Malta to prepare. Suleiman's commanders expected victory, but instead, morale sank. If a single fort had cost them so dearly, what would the whole island demand? The siege dragged into summer. Disease tore through the Ottoman camps, killing as many as the swords of the defenders. Maltese civilians fought alongside the knights, carrying water, repairing walls, even hurling rocks from the battlements when weapons ran short. Priests gave absolution in the streets, blessing men as they rushed into the fray. Women fought beside their husbands. Children served as messengers and stretcher-bearers. Malta had become a nation at war. At the heart of it all stood Jean de Valette, the Grand Master of the Knights. 70 years old, yet unyielding as iron, he strode the ramparts daily, his presence alone giving strength to the weary. He reminded them of Rhodes, of the vow that had carried their order through exile. "We did not fall then," he told them, "and we will not fall now." Again and again, the Ottomans attacked. Again and again, they were hurled back. The cost mounted. Thousands of Janissaries lay dead in the trenches. Supplies dwindled. Heat, disease, and despair gnawed at the army's will. And slowly, the tide turned. By September, the great Ottoman war machine was faltering. Reinforcements from Sicily arrived to bolster the defenders, and with one final effort, the knights surged from their bastions, driving the exhausted invaders back to their ships. The impossible had happened again. The greatest empire of the age had been stopped, broken not by numbers, but by will. Just as at Rhodes, a few hundred knights had held out against tens of thousands, defying annihilation through faith and fury. Malta became their redemption, their triumph after the bitter ashes of Rhodes. When news spread across Europe, bells rang in every city. Sermons praised the defenders as instruments of divine providence. Poets and chroniclers exalted their courage. The myth of the Knights of St. John was sealed forever. For Suleiman, the siege was a wound that never healed. He died the following year, his dream of crushing the knights unfinished. His empire still stretched vast, but in Malta, his legend had met its match. The story of Rhodes and Malta became one tale, two halves of the same legend. At Rhodes, the knights lost their home but won eternal honor. At Malta, they turned exile into victory, showing the world that courage and conviction could defy even the mightiest empire. Together, the two sieges formed one of the most extraordinary sagas of resistance in history. 500 knights, standing against 40,000 Ottomans. 6 months at Rhodes, 4 months at Malta. The numbers defy reason, yet the truth is clear. Walls fall, armies die, empires rise and crumble, but the will to resist, the belief in something greater than oneself, can shape history. Centuries later, the ruins of Rhodes and the bastions of Malta still stand as silent witnesses to those months of fire and blood. Tourists wander their streets, scarcely imagining the thunder of cannon, the cries of the dying, the clash of steel. But the stones remember, and the story endures. This is not merely the tale of knights and sultans, of sieges and battles. It is the story of human defiance, of a few who stood against many, of an island that became a symbol. It is the reminder that in the darkest hours, when the odds are hopeless and the enemy overwhelming, courage can turn despair into legend. And so, from the ashes of Rhodes to the triumph of Malta, the Knights of St. John carved their place in history. A brotherhood of warriors, sworn to defend, sworn to endure. Outnumbered, outmatched, but never outwilled. Against all odds they held. And the world still remembers.